Fireside Chat. Shining guests warm up the mic on redbullmusicacademyradio.com.
Hi, I'm Justin Broadrick, and you are listening to my Fireside Chat on Red Bull Music Academy Radio. I'm Justin Broadrick, and I've been making music, producing music since I was around 15 years old. So I've been polluting music for nigh on 25 years. Mostly in the past renowned for quite confrontational, punishing, beat brutal music in varying degrees, from guitar through to using hip-hop beats. Most of my music centred around my band Yezu, which has been in existence since about 2003, which basically is me indulging my weakness for pop music and pop structures. I think my first musical love was chiefly punk rock from the 70s. When I was about 8 years old, my parents were already quite involved in a punk band themselves in about 1977 called Antisocial. So basically I was always exposed to music, I think, since dot for me, really. I was 8 years old in 1977, and I think my parents then were really intensely into things like The Clash, Sex Pistols, and the one band they were into, which got me going as a very young kid, was The Stranglers. And that was probably my first musical love and obsession. Final being my first project was basically born from my exposure at a very young age to pioneers of power electronics, Whitehouse, which was a complete accident, just due to me hanging around in the right place in Birmingham city centre when I was about 12, 13. I was at the time obsessed with the group Crass, and particularly obsessed with the imagery, just the very look and feel of these records. The Crass fanzine Toxic Graffiti, there was a couple of pages on Throbbing Gristle. Now, I'd never heard Throbbing Gristle at that point, but I was absolutely caught by the visual presentation within the pages and this whole information overload thing and being desensitised by information. It made me really fascinated in what is this music. And I was just absolutely couldn't believe that there was more besides guitar, bass, drums, vocals in the obvious parameters of punk rock. You know, I felt like I was really hearing something extremely pure. I really connected with urban music, you know, with Throbbing Gristle. Hearing that sound, for me, was the sound that I heard out of my bedroom window. I lived with my parents above a shopping centre in a flat on a council estate. All you could hear at night was the local factories, which were just churning and grinding all night long. And I was just fascinated by this racket, you know, this alien racket that I actually felt really intimidated by, but had this love-hate relationship with. All this industrial music, which I became thoroughly obsessed with. Also, as a 12, 13-year-old who could barely play guitar, I realised that with a shortwave radio and a number of effects pedals, which my stepfather had, that I could basically make noise, so to speak, which led me to this concept of vinyl, basically, completely influenced by Whitehouse, Throbbing Gristle, and everything from that period, like Ramler, SPK, Test Department, and so on. It led me into the whole avenue of what I still term pure industrial music, you know, undiluted industrial music. I mean, vinyl has now become something that isn't based upon power electronics at all, but it was purely based upon power electronics in 1983-84, basically. Fall of Because was basically someone else's group, which was people I met in the council estate that I'm from, in Birmingham. Because I was a little kid, 12 years old, walking around in Stranglers t-shirts, in an area that was mostly full of working class shit kickers who would sooner beat you up for having a spiky haircut. So it was like one of those areas where if I saw anyone who looked remotely alternative, I would sort of gravitate to him in an extremely sad fashion, but I was 12, 13 years old, desperately looking for people who were similar, who I could identify with in any way. I saw two guys who walked around quite frequently with t-shirts like The Cure, and one day I just happened to have a chance meeting with one of these people on the street, totally random. Discovered that this guy basically soon became the other half of Godflesh, Ben Green. And I basically just got in with his little gang, who were another bunch of kids who couldn't identify with anyone else in the area, lived on the same council estate, and those three people I met there and then are all people who I now still work with in music, and this was like 1984. Ben Green became the Godflesh bass player. Another guy who I met, one of his best friends, was Dermot Dalton, and he's the Yazoo bass player. And the other guy was Paul Neville, who was a guitarist on the first couple of Godflesh albums. Ben Green and Paul Neville already had a group when I met them, which was Fall of Because. They used the drum machine. They sounded arguably like a complete copy of The Cure's album Faith. And me being fairly raw and just wanting to make a noise that, for me, reflected the council estate, as opposed to being polite about it, walked into their group and pretty much manipulated things, became the self-appointed drummer and songwriter, and sort of just basically was fairly Machiavellian, I guess, sort of a little bit distasteful, but as a 13-year-old bludgeoning to want to express myself, I guess. They were quite happy to have me come along and get in there. So Fall Because was shaped from that, basically, from this chance meeting, hanging out, growing up a bit. This is all we know in the period of, by the time I was like 15, 16, I was playing in both Napalm Death and Fall Because. They ran concurrently. one of the major highlights of being in Napalm Death was the absolute thrill of writing songs in my bedroom on a council estate and feeling like there's no way this will ever reach more than 3 or 4 people. The highlight for me was what happened after I left, was it becoming virtually a household name for X amount of time, and the way it was caught on, even the mainstream sort of caught onto it as a novelty, as a joke, obviously. But the highlight for me was after the event, was almost just the feeling of having started something so primitive and so almost flippant that it becomes this movement in a sense. It just felt like one of those absolute bizarre accidents in a way, a complete, like, something you just couldn't map or plan in any way whatsoever, and making a record like that when you're 16. I think that first Napalm Death album went on to sell something like 500,000 records, which is biggest selling album I've ever been on in my life. Why my music changed from Napalm Death to Godflesh, particularly in the context of going from a music that is hyperspeed to a music that was the absolute opposite, which was the slowest, most punishing, filthy sound I could imagine at that time, was a completely intentional thing. Towards the end of being in Napalm Death, for me, the novelty of making music and songs that were 5 seconds long, trying to cram so much information into such a short amount of time, became too novelty based even for myself. Whereas I really felt like the dirt and filth and extremity that was in Napalm Death was something I wanted to slow down to a snail's pace, basically, and to have this long drawn out effect of being punished. or self-punishment is the way I look at it. Godflesh is somewhat, for me, misconceived as an attack, but for me it was all about defence, and it was a defence for me against the horrible environment that I was brought up in, and it was my attack against. I felt weak and punished on a daily basis in the environment I went to school in and lived in, and Godflesh for me was the ultimate sound of revenge, where I felt empowered by this huge sound, yet I'd felt crushed and weak my entire childhood up until this point, you know. So it was actually an actual vehicle for these feelings in a way. Yeah. Godflesh appears to have somewhat pioneered its own sound, which has ran through music for years, actually all the way to post-metal now. For a number of years, it even influenced nu metal, which I've seen myself accused of being the root of bands like Korn, which is really quite amusing in a way that people have accused me as if it was my fault that sports metal became a big thing, you know. This is more down to the fact that I think the producers of some of these bands were really into Godflesh, and I think that's what they tried to, you know, in a somewhat typical mainstream corporate fashion, is how can we put these underground things together and make something mainstream out of it. But I think somehow Godflesh was responsible and has been responsible for both in a negative and both positive contexts for most metal music since it was recognised internationally. I think ultimately somehow I think it's some weird instinct to the sound, as opposed to it coming from Godflesh came from nowhere in a way, I guess, and it's almost that sort of thing. It wasn't a part of any big scene either in London or in America or anything. It was quite out on its own in Birmingham in some council estate. So many other groups were so concerned with having to adhere to a certain set of parameters or rule books. For me, music is about how to tear up that rule book, how to turn it on itself. Leonard Cohen had a huge impact upon me. In about 1986, one of the first things I heard by him was Bird on a Wire, which really left me feeling rather cold. But then I heard the song Avalanche, and it was virtually a life-changing moment for me. The drama and the excess of emotion and the self-indulgence as well was just totally inspiring. And the misery, of course, it was just unequaled. So it was so Leonard Cohen from that point on, after the song Avalanche was just it was just a hugely influential thing for me. It was just the sort of singer-songwriter I wished I could have been, as opposed to spending most of my life screaming and bawling my head off down a mic, you know. But yeah, and I wore his influences quite blatantly, really. I think some people do still think it could be somewhat of a coincidence, but no, Songs of Love and Hate was completely stolen, obviously, from his album and so on. His song Avalanche and the following song on the album that Avalanche is on, Master Song, I put together for a Godflesh title called Avalanche Master Song. The name of my studio is Avalanche. The name of my record label is Avalanche. And and neither go on, really. It's, for me, really, it's funny. As he matured, I've gone less and less off his material, really. It's really the first 3, 4, 5 albums, which for me are amazing. I found one early performance of him once as well. I think it's off the Beat Club, classic German old footage, and he does Suzanne, and he's so wrought in emotion that he's actually in tears while performing. And it's just absolutely stunning, like overwhelming pure emotion. And yeah, I'll always be affected by Leonard Cohen, basically.
I'll rock it, I'll rock you. Well, lift off, buckle. Atop your planet from the surface. One last orbit in the sky, I'm sure of it. But damn, does the earth bound with the market, the sun, the moon, the galaxy. I'm gonna exit intergalactic, an astronaut on a Star Trek. Look to the sun, my stars to astonish. On my journey was to the end of the galaxy. You should have seen what I dreamed. You should have seen where I've been. You should have seen what I saw. Where no man has gone before. I found the runner. No more shall we travel. Running out of orbit.
Escape from the west. Let's go to east.
With blue skies and hell. Go get your rest of pause.
Radio.com.
My relationship with Kevin Martin was the simple fact of the matter with Kevin Martin is basically he heard the first Godflesh album in London when I think it had been in rough trade maybe less than 6 hours, and he is someone clearly as passionate as I am about music, sound, etc. He was always at that time on the lookout for extremes. He came across the sleeve of the Godflesh album and asked the guy in rough trade to play him the first song. He bought it immediately, rushed home, and we had a phone number inside the record, as people did in those days. I guess instead of an email or a MySpace or whatever it is, this was actually our home phone number in one room that Ben Green, the bass player from Godflesh, and I lived in one room. Literally, Kevin Martin phoned the house phone and said, "I've just set up a club in a dirty old pub in Brixton. I've done one show and I want to put you guys on." When the first Godflesh album came out, we'd never played one show. It was the first show we ever played, was in Brixton for Kev Martin at the club that he'd only just started. By hook or by crook, but through X amount of friends, he just managed to wangle this club in Brixton. We turned up, played the show, was amazed, and we've been tied in together ever since. As soon as we met in person, it was quite clear to both of us that we share so many things in common. It was ridiculous. I mean, almost to the point of embarrassment. we just built our relationship from there. Him with his band God initially, and me guesting. I produced the first God release on Situation 2 Beggars Banquet in 1990, and then he invited me to play guitar in the band, and God accumulated more members by this time. I think there was about 13 people by the time I joined, and they were astonishing at that point, absolutely fierce. He also exposed me to many loves for me musically, like jazz. I was almost clueless about jazz until I met Kev Martin. He actually got me into things like John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and all the the right periods by these people. And we just built a relationship from there, and which eventually ended up in us combining forces to be Techno Animal. And we stayed with Techno Animal, my God, almost up until about 2003. Until I formed Yezu when I split Godflesh, and he started working as the Bug. And since then, we've both musically gone our separate ways, always kept in touch, but recently we've been back together again and helping each other out on different things. Like I play guitar on the next Bug album, which is a dub album, which is mixing with Adrian Sherwood. And he's doing some remixes for me, and etc, etc. There's a lot of, we're now back together again, and we've tied. Our lives did go quite separately for a while, but we're back as inevitably we should be.
So natural, rational, sight clear. His mind's eye blurred, a beautiful hate. Parts mouth, the black nipple breast to fill his chest with precious life once again. So blessed to breathe in time of our demise. Over strolling amongst the riots, wondering which politician shall play role of Pontius Pilate. I from those who can spill your life's blood to appease the sun. Wander streets small before you ever acquire speech from first tongue. These days remind me how heavy loom our shadows. As we board and always narrow my statue, so-called symbol of men wielding death in palms. As I chronicle theirs, in tattered books with ink so pens, we will remember them as they remember friends. Fall into the time role models, follow paths of ignorance even with acquired riches. Because wisdom not keep your human lands. What's been diagramming plans is much more grand. Much more grand. Much more grand.
For me, side projects are a part of the whole picture of who I am and why I am to some extent, because I guess I don't actually see them as side projects. They're all just projects. Everything I do is just another extension of, ultimately, of my clearly extremely exhibitionistic personality. I mean, I guess all music's about that. It's an examination to some extent of your own ego, be it quite repulsive or otherwise. And for me, all the music I make has to be that self-indulgent, I guess, in a way. And it is an examination of everything I both love and hate about myself. So with all this myriad of, your personality being somewhat infinite to some extent, I'd make music to reflect that same infinity that I feel almost within myself and feel has always been there since the womb, I guess, to some extent. Without wanting to sound too pretentious.
Red Bull Music Academy Radio.
Everything I did vocally up until Yezu was screaming and shouting, basically. And a rage, so to speak, I think. I still find that my own scream, shout, and ball of bile is still, I would differentiate between that and typical death metal growls, which are semi-indecipherable, and I still enjoy on certain records, but it was not a style that I wished to, with Godflesh it was a pure, anguished, tortured, but almost semi-decipherable. But with Yezu, I'm actually attempting to sing, and on the records, arguably, I do sing live. It's much harder to pull it off. But on record, I've tried to... all those indie pop records that I denied, that I loved for so many years with Godflesh, I just succumbed to, always did succumb to. And all the singer-songwriters that I love and admire and wished I could be as good as is what I'm trying to emulate, basically, is stuff. But I know ultimately I'm a guy that comes from a screamy shouty band for years who's now trying to sing. So it's like almost the same analogy of like when Husker Du went from being a hardcore punk band and was suddenly sounding like great folk rock influenced by like the Who and the Byrds and all these bands that I absolutely adore as well. I'm a huge fan of classic rock, and you know, it's obvious things, really obvious things, and it's something that I'm ambitious about trying to recreate in my own way with my own texture and my own tone. And the vocals almost just a bit of the icing on the cake in a way, but I've got even into more things like harmonies and stuff, so it's like, it's something I just, you know, love to explore really, but I'm not even a vocalist really. I'm just an imitation of a vocalist. I'm a pseudo-vocalist. It's been a difficult career for me because I've gone from drummer to drum machine on so many occasions, and I can never stick or feel comfortable with sticking with either to some extent. I love drum machines mostly because of hip-hop, mostly because of the huge effect they can have, the body punishment that you can get from a drum machine at loud levels and huge bass. Drummers I love because the pure physical act of drumming is so exciting. I also drum myself, so I absolutely adore drums. I adore drumming, but I adore programming drums as well. So it's like with Godflesh, the idea was to sound like a drummer with a drum machine, but with about 8 limbs. And this was achieved by programming beats on top of beats, layering on top, until it sounded as fuller than an actual physical drummer could be comfortable with, would be able physically to do. So I love both. I absolutely adore both, and wish I could have it all in a way. I wish I could be, and I do sometimes, particularly on records. I can be greedy, you know, but in live situations I can't, because playing live is always a compromise on one level or another, mostly because I'm not selling out stadiums, you know. If I was, I could have it all, but I can't. I always feel highly jealous of all these artists who can just sell millions of records and they can do whatever they want and put on the performance of their lifetime, you know. I can do what I want with my records, but in live situations it's all a compromise. eventually came to remixing wasn't even initially through my own choice, it was more an offer. When Godflesh was at quite a peak in around 1992, we had already started messing with our own remixes and remixing ourselves, which I was at the helm of, learning everything to do with studio engineering and producing, which I was becoming more obsessive with. I was totally disliking the idea of going into a studio with another producer, with another set of engineers, and being controlled. I was starting to want to control the entire thing myself, like every classic control addict does. So I learned everything I could to do with producing and remixing ourselves as Godflesh. I was offered to remix Pantera, of all groups, quite literally out of the blue, for quite a sum of money as well, which obviously was more than tempting. But I had a huge panic about the fact that at the time they were actually in the charts, and I thought, this is some mainstream metal band who are very good, but I don't know how I could deal with it, even the responsibility of it. But eventually I got over this sense of responsibility and just did what I wanted. Like, I had to approach it like I do my own music, where I just do what I want, not worry about other people. Hence I did 2 remixes for Pantera that were on a single that over here are even, it was like number 31 in the national charts here or something, which was truly weird to see a remix of my own, and I'd only just started remixing, and I wasn't even that proud of these remixes, but it set the ball rolling basically for something that I found eventually to be extremely exciting and extremely liberating. And for me, being given the freedom of someone else's music and knowing that I don't know this song inside out, but I can come to it and express it in any which way I choose, I still find infinitely exciting. I mean, songs to me are infinite anyway. There's no beginning and no end, truly. So it's like, you know, it's something you can just tap into for me. It's like, it's a stream that you can just dip your fingers in and manipulate in one shape or another, you know, and you might get something interesting, you might not, but, you know, I look at it like my own music, and that's the only way I can remix now, and I have done for many years. But the Pantera remixes is what set me off, basically, and I've loved remixing ever since. It's totally exciting. The reformation of Godflesh is still a surprise even to the other half of Godflesh. It must be said that it was something that a huge festival, metal festival, rock festival in France called Hellfest had been hassling me for maybe 3 years or so to reform Godflesh for their event, with the lure of extremely attractive finances. And we always said no, regardless of money or anything. For some reason this year, I actually spoke at some length to the other half of Godflesh about it, and we always said we'd never do this again. And for some weird, huge feeling of nostalgia came over both of us, where we're almost choked up about the idea of being able to do it on our own terms more so than doing it for a record label or whatever. We felt suddenly excited by the prospect of it, and we're still stunned that we actually said yes. And we're still sort of dealing with the ramifications now, I think. Like, what have we said? Why did we say yeah? There's no way out of it now. But no, we're absolutely thrilled by it, to be honest, because we get to play a huge show and use projections like we never got to use properly. And to have a humongous sound system. And just to do things on a level that we would have loved to have done when we existed, Because if we never split up, we'd never be offered these sort of things, and it's the classic, for me, it's a symptom of the age we're living in now, where everyone's reforming, and it's entirely embarrassing, to be honest. And we do feel somewhat embarrassed to reform, but we don't owe anything to anyone, ultimately, so we just feel this will be exciting, and we'll try it, and we'll see if we get the same sort of excitement out of it, older, more mature, arguably, than we were. But we have no intention at the moment of even making a new record. We just want to play the first few albums that we made, the purest Godflesh, the most stripped down, minimal version of Godflesh that it was always intended to be, which is just Ben Green and I and drum machine. This is for us, and we find that really exciting. We're the sort of people who would do something like that and then turn around and say never again. Or it could go the other route. It's just you'll see. That's how we feel. We'll see how this feels. We could be on stage halfway through the set going, "Why did we do this?" and walk off. We don't know. Or we could be on stage saying, "This is amazing. Why didn't we do this years ago?" So it's just total trial and error to an extent, which is part of the fun of making music in a way, I guess. You have been listening to my fireside chat on Red Bull Music Academy Radio with Justin Broadrick.